Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 5 of BPM 232, Buddhist Psychologies. So today we're going to be continuing our sort of line of exploration across the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Ennobling Provocations. So, of course, with the first Noble Truth, we looked at the question of dukkha, suffering, right? And this idea of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, which is an ever-present aspect of our experience of reality. With the second Noble Truth, we looked at the question of tanha, which is to say craving or thirst, right? The elaboration, we looked at the 3 forms of craving and various forms of craving. With the third Noble Truth, we're going to be looking at the first of the sort of steps of liberation. So as I sort of laid out at the outset, the 4 Noble Truths of the 4 Ennobling Provocations can be looked at as being diagnostic, right? There is a disease, the cause of the disease is X, there is a treatment, the nature of the treatment is Y, right? So this third one is, there is a treatment. So this is Buddhism's answer, in a certain sense, to the problem of dukkha, the problem of suffering. And that answer in Pali is nirodha, N-I-R-O-D-H-A in the English version. But people more commonly recognize this term, at least in the West, by its Sanskrit term, which is nirvana. So the answer to the problem of dukkha, the problem of suffering, is nirvana, according to the third Noble Truth. So what is nirvana? Nirvana, simply put, and we will elaborate this obviously somewhat as we go, is a kind of blowing out, right? It's the cessation of suffering through the sensation of ignorance and the sensation of, or the cessation rather of tanha, right? The elimination of craving, elimination of ignorance, and therefore, right, seeing sort of the truth of reality and the removal of dukkha. So this is where the path turns hopeful after the sort of proximate gloom of the first few stages, where it's like, oh, everything is suffering and I'm trapped in delusion and I'm trapped in illusion and etc. This is where we start to turn the corner and, so to speak, see the light. So this concept of nirodha, right, in Pali, or nirvana in Sanskrit, is a blowing out, of the candle. So to mark this, here is my votive candle for Saint Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite science fiction authors, and so we'll mark this accordingly. Okay. So what are we talking about when we're talking about nirvana? The idea, the proposal that Buddhism makes in this context is that it is possible by following a sort of a set of precepts and practices to not just temporarily, but indeed permanently remove the state of ignorance, the state of delusion, and therefore the state of craving and suffering that follows from it, right? That there is the possibility of a permanent transformation of one's mode of being. Now, very often it is the case that earlier interpreters in the West of Buddhism have interpreted it as being pessimistic. So philosophers who encountered it earlier in the West, so Schopenhauer is an interesting example. The German philosopher Schopenhauer saw it as a pessimistic religion. It has also been seen sometimes as a nihilistic religion, right? That one is looking to, in some sense, annihilate themselves. And you'll often hear people throw around terms like ego death and ego annihilation. These, generally speaking, are the sort of terms that, they don't sound great, right? But as we've already covered, this idea of it being a pessimistic, right, a sort of tragedy-based and unhappy, a nihilistic practice are sort of mistakes of interpretation as to what is being blown out. Because when the candle is blown out, what is being blown out is the ego. Now, of course, we are talking about this from the perspective of the ego. And the ego tends to react to this prospect very poorly, right? People will often have the idea that sort of with the coming of nirvana, everything that's them is going to be obliterated, washed away. But in fact, the claim that Buddhism makes is that rather, to whatever extent you can release this craving and attachment, your happiness increases, right? Because you are experiencing less suffering, you're experiencing less craving, you're trapped in fewer illusions. Your happiness increases. And if you can remove it completely, you experience an overwhelming joy and a loss of threat. All of these parts of yourself that have sort of crudded you up and accumulated, right? That aren't the real you in some sense. They're not part of your central, clear witnessing consciousness, but right, a bunch of associations and clusters that you've made, right, around yourself, worries, attachments, etc. When those things are removed, all of a sudden, right, although you had associated with them out of the way, you experience clear views of reality, clear views of, in some sense, your true nature of being. So this is the claim that Buddhism's make, right? That it is possible to enter into this state of transformation. Now, the sort of procedure by which one does that is the subject of the Fourth Noble Truth. So we'll be dealing with that next week, right? How is it that one does this? But it's worthwhile for us to take some time here, I think, and to explore the idea a little bit. Now, full disclosure, I have not experienced nirvana. It's probably not a surprise. And I suspect that probably nobody in the class has experienced nirvana either, right? Nevertheless, okay, I think it's the case that we can make certain kinds of inferences, certain kinds of comparisons and analogies, right? Which can give us some idea, okay, of what this state might be like. So there are a couple that I want to look at specifically, okay, and these are both Western ideas in a sense, but they come out of psychology and they may give us some kind of grasp, right, over this question of, well, what would this be like? Like if my ego is gone, aren't I gone? Am I experiencing anything? Why would this be a desirable state, right? And certainly from our sort of conventional standpoint of ego consciousness, it isn't. It's a scary state. People worry that if they enter into this state, like it'll destroy them, they'll be gone. And from that perspective, you can see why people might view it in sort of these pessimistic terms. Okay, but let's take a look here. And let's talk a little bit about some Western ideas that might help us get some access. Okay, so the first idea I want to talk about, and this may be one that's somewhat familiar to, is a psychological universal concept called flow. Flow. Flow was a concept originally coined by the psychologist Mahai Csikszentmihalyi. And because I'm not going to spell this out, and you might be like, what? I'm just going to show you how to spell his name. If you're not already familiar with this, this is one of these things you learn if you get involved in psychology. Mahai Csikszentmihalyi. So that's his name. Mahai Csikszentmihalyi. Okay, I'm going to leave this up for a second so you can scribble it down if you are so inclined, but Mahai Csikszentmihalyi. So Mahai Csikszentmihalyi developed the idea of flow. And flow, from the sort of best standards of research, and it's been quite extensive, okay, is a psychological universal. So it seems to be experienced across all cultures by all humans, right? Not every sort of emotional state and cognitive state is, in fact, a psychological universal, right? There are certain kinds of emotions and things that seem to be culturally bound, right? So they're experienced by people in some cultures, but not in others. And we could talk a little bit later maybe about the sort of the theory of constructed cognition and the theory of constructed affect and how those things might work. But there are other kinds of basic states that are, in fact, cultural universals, right? They're sort of human universals. So every human group that we've ever encountered, right, seems to have certain kinds of basic emotions available to it and basic states available to it, right? Waking is a very basic state, which seems to be a human cultural universal, right? Dreaming occurs in every culture. It seems to be a biological, basic human universal, right? Emotional states like anger, sadness, happiness, right? Care. These things are basic states. And you can look at the work of some psychologists around things like emotion. So Ekman has a sort of famous theory about core emotional states. And my personal favorite in this field is the fellow who invented the theory of affective neuroscience, Jaak Panksepp, who sadly died a few years ago. And I love Panksepp's work, not least because I think that he has penetrating insights into sort of the nature of emotion, but also because he had a side career as, I kid you not, an owl tickler. An owl tickler. And if you're wondering what that means, go Google Yak Panksepp. So if you just need Panksepp, P-A-N-K-S-E-P-P, Panksepp, and owl tickler. So one of the things that Panksepp sought to establish was that tickling and laughter were basically far more common in the animal world than we might think. And so he developed protocols for tickling mice and rats and owls. And so you can see footage of Yak Panksepp tickling owls. And indeed, when you tickle them, they emit short, breathy hoots. This has got to be basically like one of the best jobs in the world, animal tickler for science. Anyway, so I'm very fond of Yak Panksepp. But any of those people have basic theories, okay, about sort of the states of emotion and the states of cognition, the states of consciousness that we all share collectively. Now, when Mahai Csikszentmihalyi first sort of proposed and outlined the theory of flow, he wanted to see in part if it was indeed a cultural universal, if it turned up across every human group, every human population. And indeed, it seems it does. So what is flow? Flow is a state of optimal psychology. Optimal psychology. What does that mean? When one is in a flow state, as Csikszentmihalyi puts it, one is both performing optimally, but is also experiencing a sort of optimal mood state. So one feels really good, right? But also one is performing at an exceptionally high level. Now, if you look at the work of Csikszentmihalyi, you'll see that there are sort of a set of conditions that he outlines for engendering the flow state, right? So you have to have sort of timely feedback, right? On your performance. So you have to have immediate timely feedback. There have to be sort of well-defined goals, right? You have to have some way of knowing if you're succeeding or failing, and that feedback has to be timely. And there are a few other conditions of this kind. However, provided you meet those conditions, it is possible to enter this flow state. Now, odds are you've probably, if you're not familiar with the term, experienced a flow state. We have lots of different names for this, right? So like being in the zone is one. People who play sports report this relatively frequently, right? That like, oh, I was really in the zone, right? To be in the zone is to be in a flow state in Csikszentmihalyi's sense, right? On one hand, one is, again, performing in an optimal fashion. One is playing the game very, very well, right? But also one is experiencing optimal mood, right? It feels amazing to be in a flow state. And you may have experienced a flow state in all kinds of things. It's possible to have a flow state in conversation, for instance, right? You can hit a conversational flow state with somebody. When you have a really great conversation, that's typically what's happened. You've hit a flow state, right? It's possible to hit a flow state in dance, for instance, right? You're dancing and you really, kick it off. It's possible to hit a flow state in writing. So I used to work as a professional writer. I still enjoy doing writing. And sometimes writing is a grind. As you are doing your own assignment writing, know that I have a deep compassion because I very often have a hard time starting writing. But it's not uncommon once I start for me to gear up. And once I start going, right, I often hit a flow state where it seems like the words are sort of flying out of me. I experience this highly optimized state where I'm doing really good work and it's kind of coming out, right? Flow state. There are lots of other conditions where we can experience flow state. One that's relatively common these days, in fact, is video games, right? And the reason that video games often engender flow states is they're basically designed to do so, right? They are, in a sense, flow hijacking machines. They're designed to give you flow. So if you think about playing a video game, right? The video game is very often sort of quite evenly matched to your level of ability, right? Often a video game gets harder and harder and harder as you go, but it's always just ahead of your level of ability. It's in what the Soviet developmental psychologist Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development, right? So it's staying sort of just ahead of your ability level. It's forcing you to stretch just enough. It's not so much above your ability level that you experience anxiety, but nor is it so far below that you experience boredom, right? So if it's too far below your ability, boredom. If it's too far above your ability, anxiety, right? It's right in that middle where you're sort of stretching to get in there. And a video game offers, of course, well-defined goals and immediate feedback. As you're doing stuff, you can kind of tell. Look, I'm my main controller. As you're doing stuff, you can kind of tell, right, whether or not you're succeeding and failing. Very often with explicit feedback mechanisms built into the game, right? Points, dings, cheers, et cetera, et cetera. Now, interestingly, actually, the first video game that sort of hit on this basically did it by accident. The first video game to sort of be a flow machine in this sense was the classic arcade game Space Invaders from the 1970s. And the interesting thing about Space Invaders, it was an accident. They didn't mean to produce a flow machine, but it's interesting how they did it. So what happened was, of course, in this original arcade machine, there was an old school television, okay? And it wasn't like a modern monitor. An old school television used an electron gun, what's called a raster, R-A-S-T-E-R, raster. So the raster, right, there was pixels on the TV. If you've ever seen an old TV, they're very low resolution compared to what we're used to now. But it would, basically this electron gun would pick out individual sort of pixels of color on the screen. Like it would sweep down the screen and paint lines. Okay, your monitor is doing something not dissimilar, but of course it's not using an electron gun in that sense anymore. These are like the TVs that are big boxes, right? Back out. So here you are, you're playing the video game, and the raster is painting, essentially, is going down the screen and it's painting lines on the screen. Now, if you've ever seen Space Invaders, it's a pretty simple game, right? Although it is quite compelling. So you've got, say, at the bottom of the screen, right? You've got here, I'll use this. At the bottom of the screen, you've got your spaceship, right? And you go kind of back and forth like this. You slide back and forth at the bottom and you can shoot, right? Pew, 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 right? So you shoot back and forth. From the top of the screen are coming waves of enemies, right? And at this point, you're asking yourself, what does this have to do with nirvana? But stay with me. So from the top of the screen, you're seeing waves of enemies, right? And they go doot, 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 doot. They come down and you're moving back and forth and shooting them before they get there. And meanwhile, they're dropping bombs and stuff at you. And if they get to the bottom, you die. So when they initially built the game, okay, when they initially built the game, they made a slight mistake. The more stuff the raster had to draw on the screen, right, as it swept down, the slower the game went, right? So as more enemies appeared, they'd get slower and slower and slower. And so therefore the game would actually get easier. And this obviously was a bad design, right? The game is supposed to, at the very least, stay equally difficult. If there are more enemies, they shouldn't go slower and be easier to hit, right? So the programmers, right, went in and they made a small alteration. They just altered it so that as there were more enemies, the game sped up, right? Sped up its processing. So then the raster would paint faster, but they overcorrected it. So now, as more enemies appeared, they actually went faster and faster and faster. Okay, before they made this change to the game, people found it interesting, but not exactly compelling. After they made this change to the game, people found the game basically completely addictive, right? This ever increasing level of difficulty as they were moving back and shooting was so compelling, in fact, that a number of the early Space Invaders arcade boxes that they put in places for people to use, they were getting reports from the people in those places, right? Arcades and bars and things, pinball halls, right? They were getting reports like the machine is broken. And when they went in to go look at it, what had happened is that people had put so many quarters inside the arcade machine that it had filled up the coin box and pressed up on the circuit board. Like that's how much this thing was being played. It was just completely stuffed with quarters because people were playing it. This was sort of an important breakthrough discovery in video games, right? Because it was the first time, it seemingly anyway, that a video game managed to produce this flow state. The ever-increasing difficulty, right, was one of the conditions for producing flow. As people got better at the game got harder. Since then, flow states have been deliberately incorporated into video game design. So video game designers know more or less exactly what they're doing. And it's not the only thing, but like many video games, World of Warcraft, for instance, it's actually, these companies have actually employed psychologists and economists to make their video games as compelling as possible, right? And there's a number of ways they do that. We're not going to get into that at length. But one of the things that they do is they create the conditions for flow states. So a flow state feels really good, and it is a state of optimal performance, right? it feels good enough, right, that typically speaking, when we're engaged in an autotelic activity, which is to say something we do for its own sake, play usually rather than work, which is a telic activity for something else. When we're engaged in an autotelic activity, right, very often it's because it produces a flow state. These are the things that we enjoy. And if you can get a job that involves having flow states, you're a good distance of the way to having a happy career. You can do something that has a flow state. Okay, so what are the conditions? What is it like to experience one of Csikszentmihalyi's flow states? Like, right, we know that it's optimally performing, right? But why is it a state of optimal psychology? Why is it an optimal experience? Because people do report it as a powerful experience. Well, it's not a relaxed experience per se. It's not exactly a pleasurable experience, right? It's not pleasurable in the sense that, like, consuming or sex or relaxation, right? These things are pleasurable, but it is nevertheless an experience that is highly sought. People will do a lot, right? And so insofar as a video game machine is basically a flow hijacking machine, right? Video games can be extremely compelling. So why? Well, one of the reasons that has been pointed out is that one of the traits of being in a flow state is that you lose your sense of self-consciousness. You lose your sense of self-consciousness. When you're in a flow state, you lose your sense of self-consciousness. Now, this is not the same as you lose consciousness, okay? It's your sense of self-consciousness, right? Not your sense of consciousness. So you don't pass out, right? But you lose your sense of self-consciousness. What does that mean? Well, most of the time, right, when we're doing things, we are sort of simultaneously conscious of whatever we're conscious of, but there is also an inner loop of commentary, right? We have thoughts, we have feelings, we maybe have an inner critic, we have something interrupting us, right? We are very aware of ourselves. If you've ever felt, profoundly awkward, if you have any notes of social anxiety, which I'm no stranger to, right? You may have had the experience of, suddenly walking into a group, right? Or being in a place and suddenly feeling intensely self-conscious, right? Being extremely aware of how you look, how you're holding yourself, how people may be seeing you, right? All of this is sort of coming at you, how you're performing, how you're doing. That sense of self-consciousness is often terrible for us. It's not invariably terrible, but it's often quite unpleasant. One of the signature things about a flow state is that that sense of self-consciousness is gone, right? It's not present. Now, when we lose self-consciousness, again, that doesn't mean that we lose consciousness. In fact, if anything, our consciousness intensifies. So when we have a flow state, it's often akin to what the psychologist Abraham Maslow referred to as a peak experience, right? Our experience brightens up, our memory of it sharpens, like we have an intense, immediate experience. What we don't have is all of this extra processing, commenting on it, nagging us, criticizing us, making us think about ourselves. Instead, we are simply invested. So think about the examples that I've given, right? Sport, dance, right? Writing, conversation. You lose yourself in it, right? When you're in the zone, you lose yourself in it. You get absorbed into what you're doing so that you are no longer self-conscious in this agonizing way, but instead you are simply consciously fused with the activity. And as such, you perform the activity exceptionally well. Now, there are a number of other, right, kind of important traits and properties of flow. This isn't going to be sort of an exhaustive take on Csikszentmihalyi's flow. But I want to propose to you that the flow state, right, is in some sense a taste of what it would be like, right, to experience the blowing out. Your regular ego state, and a large part of this sort of self-critical material, which in neuroscience is characterized by a brain network called the default mode network. The default mode network. We're going to come back to that later. So default mode network. Okay, the default mode network basically turns down, right? It ceases being active, and instead you have this outwardly focused, but also enormously kind of self-aware, optimal experience. In a way, this is a kind of taste, right? And so one proposal is that what could we think about the nature of nirvana? It may be that nirvana is a kind of perpetual flow state, a kind of perpetual state of insight and merger and involvement without, right, this sort of pesky self-consciousness, right, chewing at us on the side. Okay, that's one possibility. Another possibility that I want to propose to you is an idea that comes from Robert Foreman, the researcher Robert Foreman, and it's called the pure consciousness event. Now, we're going to unpack this idea at greater length later, but Foreman, as a researcher, was very interested in deep states of sort of mystical experience, deep states of non-duality and unity, okay? So when you begin to delve into the meditative literature, as indeed we will do later on in the course, we'll begin to look at some of these states in more detail. But when you begin to delve into the meditative literature, you'll often find these accounts from advanced meditators about stages of non-duality, right? So for instance, there may be a concentration meditation on a candle, for instance. And one thing is to like fix your attention onto the candle flame until the candle flame occupies your mind. In a sense, you merge with it, okay? A further state above this is a state where often there is a kind of non-duality between your inner experience and your outer experience, right? So there's like a fusion. You experience a continuity between the inner and the outer, right, as a fairly advanced kind of meditative discipline. But there is also a highly advanced state, which is often described, okay, in which meditation, right, your meditation, often in a mindfulness meditation frame, is so reduced, you empty your thoughts so thoroughly that you open a space that has no content. So you are conscious, okay, you're sitting in meditation, you're conscious, but you're not conscious of anything. Now that sounds like a contradiction in terms to people, right? You're like, well, if you're not conscious of anything, you're not conscious. People typically think of consciousness as sort of referring to things, right? This is technically known in philosophy as intention, that thoughts they have intention, they point at stuff, right? So if there's nothing in your consciousness, how can you be conscious? But the claim that both these meditative systems make and that Foreman makes is that indeed there's such a state. And he calls this state the pure consciousness event. And we're going to look at this in more detail because we're going to examine some of these meditative systems as we go. But this pure consciousness event, okay, opens a space for people where, right, they are still conscious, but they're not conscious of anything. There's no content in their mind. They're not imagining stuff. They're not having thoughts. They're not having feelings. They're just opening a space that is just conscious, right? Sort of consciousness, conscious of itself, right? Consciousness, conscious of itself. So sort of a minimally self-referential loop, okay, going in their head. And this state is often seen as being a sort of a highly advanced meditative state, this pure consciousness event. Okay, so one of the things that then characterizes that, right, is that in order for that to work, one has to practice their meditation to the point when your mind stops spontaneously elaborating things. So if you sit on the meditation pillow now, you're almost certainly going to have monkey mind, right? Random thoughts are going to pop in your head, random feelings, memories, plans, fantasies, whatever. Those of you who are sort of trying meditation on for size or have done meditation in the past will be very familiar with this. Your mind will be bouncing all over the place. And often, as I've said, there's a sort of beginner's luck effect the first time you sit on the pillow and you think, oh yeah, zoning in on enlightenment. And then the second time you sit on the pillow, you're like, oh no, completely, my mind is out of control, right? And often it takes diligent sitting for a number of weeks, diligent continuous practice before you start to get a taste of being able to catch your thoughts, right? To mindfully catch your thoughts, return to your breath. As you begin to empty those contents out, however, right, you learn a trick, which is, normally one thought leads to another thought leads to another. This is elaboration. This is propensia. And it's very often that kind of reactivity that's happening that we talked about around the second noble truth, right? Something happens and we react to it immediately. Instead, much as I described last week, one learns to sort of interrupt that flow of reaction, right? To stop the reactivity. And when one does so, the normal elaboration that would therefore lead to sort of craving and therefore suffering, right, stops, right? So the idea is that the pure consciousness event is opening up a space where you have sort of literally put pause on all that stuff. Now you can imagine if you could carry a state like that back into the conscious world, right? A state not where you're aware of nothing, because you would want to be aware of stuff around you, rather a state where you could stop all the elaboration, right? Where you could stop all the elaboration, where you didn't have sort of reactive thoughts per se to anything. You just experienced things, and then you deliberated and responded to them, but you didn't have any of this reflex response. That's where the pure consciousness event points. Now, we're going to talk, as I said, more about that later, because it's a somewhat elaborate topic and deserves a deeper dive when we get into that. So, again, the truth of the end of suffering, right, as proposed by the third noble truth, right? We've already covered how craving, ignorance, and therefore craving, is what leads to suffering. We want things to be a certain way, or for things to not be a certain way, but the world doesn't cooperate with us. However, instead, right, by interrupting that, we begin to enter a state where we stop having those ideas. That's the theory, that you can literally blow it out, right? A permanent kind of transformation in the nature of being. That you become something else. Now, an important fact to remember about this is that within sort of Buddhist doctrines, the whole reason that this is possible for you, okay, is that these various elaborations, this, stuff that has glommed onto you in terms of, your ego ideas and your associations and your cravings and your clinging and, right, all this stuff, isn't actually an essential part of you at all, right? It's sort of stuck on. But in fact, it's possible to push it off because it's not an essential part of you. So even though, right, suffering, dukkha, right, is inevitable, it's not permanent. It's not necessarily permanent. Even though it's inevitable that you're going to experience it, it's not necessarily permanent. Okay? It's inevitable, but not permanent. And this is because, in theory, there's been a part of your mind, a part of your being, that has been actually accessing the truth all along. You are cluttered up, as I am, we are all, cluttered up and associated with this sort of whirling, right, tornado of crap that we've decided is us, but that isn't our essential nature. This is where you get the idea of Buddha nature, right? Buddha nature, which is the idea that behind all of that, there is a more essential nature of mind that doesn't have to do with any of that stuff. And it, in fact, has clear access to reality to begin with. That is what enables us, ultimately speaking, to achieve nirvana. If we can remove all the crud, then what is left over is actually our essential nature, our Buddha nature, right? And all these things that we associated with, all these things we agonized over and clung onto and craved, and, right? Illusion, ignorance, not actually us, right? Not actually us. And that's why when you blow up the ego, you don't become a miserable mess. You, in fact, right, are awake and aware, right? And happy, right? There is a deep joy that comes from this because you're suddenly free from a set of illusions and delusions that, in fact, you've been wrestling with all this time, and it turns out to have been unnecessary, right? And so you can penetrate through, right? Break through delusion. So the idea is, right, the Buddha nature is this background process, and it's there already, right? It's actually there, and it is the more essential nature in the Buddhist doctrine, right? Right. And that basically is what allows us to sort of make contact, in some sense, with the truth, right? If we didn't have it, we wouldn't be able to realize nirvana. It's scraping away all this other stuff, right? Releasing, letting it go, all these other aspects that allows us to reach that central truth. Okay, so that's sort of the brief form of this. It's difficult for us to elaborate this much further because, as I mentioned, the fourth noble truth is going to be, sort of concerned with the question of the path, right? How do we do this, right? And that's, in some ways, the really interesting part. It's like, okay, cool. Like there's a ray of sunshine in this whole formula, but what does one actually do to get there? And that's what the fourth noble truth is concerned with. So, next week. And spoilers, it does come in a numbered list because Buddhists love numbered lists. So we will touch on that at greater length. But before we kind of sign out, I've given you a couple of sort of scientific, right, psychological ways of thinking about, right, that cessation, that blowing out. But I think it's interesting to consider some personal experience aspects. So one that I can think of. So I lived in India for a year when I was 30, and which was wonderful. I had wanted to visit since I was 16, and I couldn't go when I was 16, and I ended up starting a business to try to monetize an invention so that I could raise money to go to India, and then I ended up getting more into the business, and I got sidelined. It kind of didn't happen. But when I was 30, and another business fell through, I decided, okay, like it's time to go. Circumstances lined up, and so I went. And I lived for the most part outside New Delhi, kind of in the Mississauga of New Delhi, Gurgaon. But I had the opportunity to travel all over the place. So I traveled to Mumbai and traveled a few times up into the mountains. And indeed, I had the opportunity to travel up to McLeodganj and Dharamshala, which is the location of the Tibetan community in exile. So, when Tibet was sort of invaded, right, the Tibetan community fled along with the 14th Dalai Lama, and they set up a community in exile in the Himalayas in northern India, and they've sort of been operating there since. So there's a whole community up there of Tibetan Buddhists. Now, when I went up there, I mean, it was interesting. I went to lots of sort of temples and things when I lived in India. I went to a really amazing monkey temple in Shimla, where the monkeys are, they're just little gangsters. They're little mean people. As a very brief aside on that note, I will just say this, which some of you I'm sure will recognize. But after I lived in India, I came to a realization about monkeys, which is that everybody who comes from a country that doesn't have monkeys thinks monkeys are cool and cute. And everybody that comes from a country that does have monkeys hates monkeys, right? And this is something that I didn't quite grasp until I lived in a country with a number of different monkeys. And I realized that the reason is that monkeys are goblins, basically. They are highly intelligent, sort of human-shaped, right? But they are like thieves. They can be quite aggressive and territorial, and there's lots of them moving around, right? So to see them ranging around on building tops, scaring people and stealing their laundry, and right, they'll get enough food. Anyway, this monkey temple at Shimla was, dedicated to monkey gods, and therefore was covered in monkeys. The monkeys kind of had free range of the place. And one of the things that they warned you about when you were heading up was like, make sure you guard your glasses. And I am super blind without these, like really, really blind. I can barely see, a few feet in front of me without them. So I was quite nervous about this. So I, took my glasses off and made my way up. And no sooner did I get to the top, keep your eyes low so you're not making eye contact and challenging the monkeys. No sooner did I get to the top than I immediately saw a monkey go tearing ass past me with some guy's glasses. So they do snatch the glasses off people's face, and then often the attendants at the monkey temple have to like bribe them with food or something to get them to give the glasses back. They got a fascinating little racket. However, in Dharamshala, McLeodganj, the Tibetan community in exile, there is a mixture. So there are, of course, lots of Tibetan monks. And I was quite struck by a number of things. Obviously, this is a very spiritual location, right? There is lots of sort of Vajrayana art and temples and practitioner seekers, lots of Western seekers, obviously. But also, I would see a large number of monks, and they were not always what I expected. So I would see people in full monastic robes, like riding little motorcycles and smoking with girlfriends on the backs of their motorcycles and stuff. This totally jarred me, right? I had this idea of sort of the purity of the monastic tradition and so on and so forth. But of course, it's the case that many people don't exactly become monks voluntarily, right? They're sort of dropped off with the monastery, right? So the monastery raises them, right? But that may not mean that they are necessarily like devoted. And it's also the case that there is a tantric thread in Vajrayana, and tantric threads do not necessarily reject. They're not quite as austere as for instance, Theravada often is, right? There is this idea that actually the pursuit of physical pleasure and stuff, you can exhaust yourself on it. I mentioned that a bit last week. Anyway, the Tibetan community in exile was quite interesting. It was a very interesting experience in that sense. So while I was up there, I stayed in a house, and the area up in the Himalayas has, if you've ever been there, you're both familiar with this, big spiders, big. Okay. So the first time I ever saw one of these things, we had just driven up the mountains, and it was a long, fairly kind of terrifying, frankly, experience, because the roads are narrow and they sometimes don't have guardrails, and they're often not quite wide enough to accommodate both the car you're in and the truck that's coming in the opposite direction. And if you look off the side, you can see like a sheer 3,000-foot drop, off the side of the Himalayas, with like a burned bus that plunged to its doom 25 years before or something down there. So it's a pretty white knuckle experience. We had a professional driver taking us through, but as became clear when we were ascending the mountains, he didn't have, it's seemingly much more experience driving in the mountains than we did. So it's a pretty terrorizing experience. And we drove up there. We arrived early in the morning, to my enormous relief, and I handed him a huge stack of rupees to go get himself something to eat, and thanked him profusely that we arrived alive. We checked in at the house, and so it was early morning. We hadn't gotten sleep really, and so I decided to mix myself a drink. And the caretaker of the house made us chai tea, so I had a chai and a drink, and I decided to just like sit on the deck and relax. And I had this tremendous experience. It was sort of early morning, and I experienced one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. So we were fairly high up the mountain, right? The actual community was kind of below us, right? And so sitting on the balcony having my drink, I think I was having a gin and tonic, and my chai tea, right, and trying to relax before I went to bed after this white knuckle experience through the mountains, I was looking off the side, and below us, rising up from the valley, was a thunderstorm. So there was a thunderstorm rolling up the side of the mountain. So I was looking at the thunderstorm from the top, right, which was a strikingly strange experience. Looking at this thunderstorm from the top, I could see it rising, big dark cloud kind of rising up the mountain underneath me, right, and I could see flashes of lightning in it, which was a weird experience. I'd never had that before. And the air above it was just perfectly clear, right, just perfectly crystalline clear, and filled with all these tiny white and yellow butterflies. It was so strikingly beautiful. It was one of these moments I was like, this isn't real, right? This isn't happening. This isn't real. It was just astoundingly beautiful. One of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. So here I am, and I'm sort of looking out in the space, and I'm just struck, like awestruck by the beauty of this experience, watching the thunderstorm roll up the valley towards us, and these little butterflies. And meanwhile, the people I was traveling with turned in to bed. And I'm having my drink, and I'm regarding this, and then I'm kind of getting ready, and all of a sudden, one of the people runs out, and she says, "There's a spider in my room." And I say, "Okay." And she says, "There's a spider in my room. I'm not sleeping in there with that thing." And I have always had a soft spot for spiders. I kind of like them. I think they're actually quite beautiful. I like bugs, generally speaking, broadly construed. I like animals, period. But spiders don't bother me. A lot of people are terrified of them. They don't particularly bother me. I don't mind them. And my custom has been since I was a child. Is there a spider, a fly? I don't kill those things. I herd them onto a piece of paper and I take them outside. So she says, "I'm not sleeping in the room with that thing." And I say, "Okay, I'll deal with it. I've now been bolstered by a chai tea and a gin and tonic. I'm feeling good." I was like, "Okay, yeah, that's okay. I'll deal with it." So I go into the kitchen and I grab, a glass so that I can grab the spider. And I go into the room, and then I look and I see this thing on the wall. And I realize in that moment that the glass that I have to capture it in is woefully inadequate. Like, it's just not up to the task, because this spider is not a spider. It's a spider. It's like this. Okay, it's like this big around with the legs, and it's beefy. It's hairy. It's like it's muscular. Okay, the spider on the wall. And so I look at this thing and I'm like, okay, So I look around and I see there's like a wicker garbage can. And so I grab the garbage can and I grab, I don't know, a copy of Vogue or Cosmopolitan or something to hit the top. And I start to come at it, and the spider, of course, is on the wall and they have eyes pointing in every direction. So it sees me and it tenses up. And I'm like, okay, here we go, here we go. And I lead the spider and it starts to run down, and I, get the spider in the basket and I slide the magazine on top. I take the spider out to the deck and I put it out on the lawn, and it runs off into the grass. Nevertheless, the person who was concerned about the spider ended up sleeping like a mummy, completely wrapped in blankets. Okay, that was not the last spider we saw. Indeed, a few days later, maybe the next day, I saw another one in the bathroom, and it was big. It was sort of on the door jamb. And this time, less surprised by the sort of muscularity and presence of this spider, I decided I would kind of, look at it. And so the other people I was traveling with are kind of standing back and they're like, deal with it. And I'm like, oh, hold on. So I'm sort of leaning down to look at this thing. And of course, all of a sudden it has seen me again and it makes a run for it. That sort of spooks me because I know, is it poisonous? I don't know. And it jumps off the wall and runs underneath the carpet. And yes, in that moment, I turned to the other two people, the women I was traveling with, and said, see, it's gone. And let me tell you, if angry looks could shoot eye lasers, they would have melted my head off. They were not happy with me as it scuttled underneath the carpet. The point is, okay, where am I going with this? I saw quite a few spiders up in the mountains. But the interesting thing is that after I was there a while, I began to see phantom spiders. I began to interpret things as spiders that were not, in fact, spiders. I would see a leaf or something move, and my brain would interpret it as a spider. I'm not afraid of spiders, but I was very wary of them. Again, I wasn't certain these were big spiders, which might mean that they're harmless, but it might also mean that they're venomous, and I didn't know. So these sort of huge Himalayan mountain spiders were around, but I started seeing them all over the place. And, 99% of the time, right, when I saw a spider, it wasn't actually there. My mind was seizing on something and interpreting it into a spider with sort of an abundance of caution, right? With an abundance of caution. Now, you've probably had a comparable experience. I think there are lots of default hardwiring experiences of this kind. One that I like to mention is if you've ever seen a YouTube video of somebody putting a cucumber behind a cat, and the cat turns around and it'll jump about 4 feet straight into the air, presumably because it sees that as a snake, and that's hardwired, right? It sees a snake where there's in fact a cucumber. Well, here I was seeing spiders where it was a shadow or a leaf or a whatever, right? Some spiders everywhere while I was up in the Himalayas. And when I returned, when I went back to New Delhi, which does not have such beefy, muscular spiders, I continued to see spiders of this kind for some time. There was this resounding sort of echo of spiders that I was seeing everywhere. And it gradually faded, right? At first, I was still seeing spiders. So is that a spider? Is that a spider? Is that a spider? Right? My mind was seeing spiders. But gradually, as time went on, right, I was like, it's not a spider. There aren't these spiders here, right? We're basically in the desert. My mind ceased to see it. The illusion, in a sense, faded away, right? So this was an experience where my mind was really hanging on to a certain kind of interpretation in an attempt to protect me, fair enough. But nevertheless, right, although did I need protecting? Nevertheless, I was continuing to interpret things in this particular way. And then it gradually released, it faded away. So I offer that to you as an interesting experience of what it is like when a certain kind of delusion, a certain kind of illusion, a certain kind of interpretation of things fades away. And there weren't spiders. Most of those things weren't spiders. It was just my mind interpreting things in a particular kind of way. When we talked about the sort of two notions of truth in Buddhism, that there are metaphysical truths about the world, and then there are, provisional truths, the truths that we bring to the table with interpretation. We talked about that last week. When that starts to fade out, when you cease to experience it in the same way, there is a kind of powerful relief and clarity that goes with that. I began seeing things for what they were again. So that was kind of a rambly story, but I use that as an example of what it's like when one has one of these kinds of mental fixations and it starts to fade out, blow out. So hopefully between sort of these examples that I've given you, you're beginning to pick out some idea of nirodha or nirvana. And next week, we're going to begin to discuss the actual how-to. How does this whole thing work? How do we move towards this state where we can release our delusion, release our craving, and thus relieve our suffering? So that is the subject of next week.